This is a Space Marine head. I'm guessing we've all painted a few of those in our time. This is also a Space Marine head, and it's one I'm much more interested in painting. Morphternoon folks, Mark here, and welcome to the sofa. I thought we'd enjoy a bit of a change of pace this time, just a nice chill painting session. So, feel free to grab a brush and a project, and I'll see you and this guy over on the painting table.
Okay, I'm not going to bore everyone with how bad I am at Blender, so I'll just show the various pieces that I actually built this thing in, so that it would print properly. It also means that I can take it apart for painting when I get there. Kind of nice to think ahead, for once. And there we go. Printed. I'd basically built it normal scale, and then just turned up the percentage when it came to printing, so I'd kind of gone overboard with it, but he is pretty imposing now. Oh yeah, and because I'm an absolute genius, I glued the backpack onto the chest, then dropped them, smashed the backpack off, and that snapped the pin I'd actually printed to keep everything aligned and in place. I had to replace that with milliput. Given the size of him though, he looked way too clean for having been in thousands of years of war. So I needed to battle damage him just a bit before I got to painting. In the spirit of careful planning, I just grabbed a huge pile of tools, threw them all down on the table, and set to with whatever came to hand that felt right. Okay, so the first thing I did was cut too deep and poke a hole in the face, which then let the dribbles of liquid resin inside ooze out. The second was learning that green stuff couldn't plug the hole, so I had to leave it in the sun for a bit to seal back up. And then I just hacked him about with knives and files and drill bits and saws until I was happy with how he looked. I'm particularly fond of these craft knife saw blade things. I've no idea where I got them. But their oddly large teeth are just right for gouging into things like a chainsword or a chain axe would. I deliberately made Mark 7 Aquila armor because it's pretty common and has been around for ages in the lore. Sure, there are probably more interesting helmets, like the good old Beaky, but I didn't want them to look like they were actually in the Horus Heresy times. Equally though, I didn't want a brand new shiny Primaris Marine. I didn't exactly plan to snap a huge chunk off the back vent, but once I'd done it, I was kind of stuck, and with a little bit of extra chopping, it looks pretty good. I've tried to give him lots of different types of damage, so it looks like he's been in different battles against different opponents over his life. Just a little nod to the kind of history of him. When I decided to paint a Space Marine, it wasn't going to be a boring regular chapter. Definitely no tedious blue armoured Marines in here. Instead, I went for the 21st Founding, also known as the Cursed Founding because the Imperium really half-arsed it and ended up with a load of dysfunctional Marines. If you remember the old lore, the Firehawks will sound familiar. A chapter decked out in red and yellow that were doing pretty well until they failed to return from a jump through the warp. Lore buffs can probably work out where this is leading, but not just yet. There's stuff to do first. Starting with airbrushing the base colours. I don't particularly want to try and hand paint the shoulder pads yellow, or the rest of it red. They aren't exactly the easiest colours to get smooth. I pretty much always mix in some browns, flesh tones or creams to give them a little more opacity, but it's still quicker and easier to put them in the airbrush. Bit of a disclaimer though, don't do what I did and just spray your colour straight onto the resin. It's not a great idea and that will probably come back to bite me at some point in the future. But I got carried away, I did the yellow first, and then I was kind of stuck. To protect it a little, I actually sprayed a layer of gloss varnish over it and let that dry off. And then I settled down and masked up the helmet. I used tape for the straight line, and then just liquid mask for the face, because it's a more complicated shape. I've always had trouble getting liquid mask to stay where I put it, so I tend to paint the edges in with just whatever paint I'm then going to be airbrushing in before I put the liquid mask on. I'm sure this is basic knowledge, but it was a while before I realised that it was going to make my life easier. I used to do it at the end. The liquid mask is easy to remove with just a clay shaper, or a piece of eraser, anything that grabs hold of it. And there's the holes left because I didn't put any primer on. So I had to quickly retouch those. It's a good job I keep spare paint around when I've mixed stuff. This is the best part of the project now, freehanding those huge blank shoulder pads. It's sort of the reason I did such a huge Marine. I'm one of those odd people that enjoys adding freehand details to everything. Like this flaming hawk, which I printed out so I didn't have to keep prodding my phone awake. The first thing I had to do is get the centre line drawn in and some mostly symmetrical markers for the wing positions. After that, I can start blocking out the rough shape. Then it's a slow refinement process, which is easier here because I can just paint the yellow back in if I mess up. This is about the point that I realised I'd gone a little too low on the plate and the tail flames weren't going to fit. But, oh well, not going to start again just for that. Anywho, after some tidying up of the lines and a couple more red coats for colour, I was one pad down. The other one was going to be a tactical squad designation, aka an arrow, with some flames. I masked off the outline of the arrow to make life easier, filled it in, and then decided to add extra details. A squad number, to be exact. That was a bit of careful roughing out and filling in again, but I like to tell myself it adds a bit more story. Once I peeled the tape away, I ended up widening the shaft a little, and then having to try and press the paint ridge from the masking down flat. The final step on this pad was to put red flames across the bottom, except where the arrow would be. I painted those yellow. Having spent an hour painting each shoulder pad, I quickly sponged on some yellow to make them look a little less pristine and moved on to the final stage. At this point, I'd like to give everyone a primer on how to use oil paints on miniatures. I mean, I'd like to, but I don't really have a clue what I'm doing, so instead I'm just going to guess my way through it. First off, I'd sealed all the parts with gloss varnish before I tried this. Otherwise, the white spirit will just strip the paint. Speaking of which, I thinned down some burnt umber with white spirit and began painting it as a rough shade wherever I thought shadows would sit. Oils dry really slowly, but the white spirit will speed that up to just a few days in my experience. Still plenty of time to smooth out those brown patches. Which I did with a clean, dry brush after giving the worst of the white spirit time to evaporate. After waiting a few days for the oils to dry fully, I can move on to the details, starting off with the metalwork. The iron was a pretty unimaginative black, dark metal, brighter metal. I didn't want anything too fancy or distracting for this, there'd be time for that later. It took a little bit longer than expected because I'd put a lot of gouges into the armour, and that just kind of slowly dragged on with every single one needing highlighting. For the Aquila and shoulder trims, I went with gold because that's how it looks in the pictures. Again, nothing too fancy. A dark bluey green as a sort of matte shade, and then a couple of gold colours just to brighten it all up. Mounting him on a plinth would involve drilling a hole in the bottom of the torso, and that was just going to lead to goo everywhere. So, I drilled a larger hole, almost big enough for the brass rod, and carefully flushed out the inside with isopropyl alcohol. Unless you're an idiot like me, you probably want to wear gloves for this. I forgot, and then realised a little late, and spent the rest of the time trying not to get resin on my fingers, and then making sure I cleaned it all off afterwards. Once the gunk I sucked back out was mostly clear, rather than grey sludge, I knew I'd got rid of the majority of the resin, certainly enough to make sure it wouldn't ruin the glue up later. With all the painting done, and the torso ungooped, it was time to stick him together. To make sure he really stayed together, I mixed up some epoxy to go inside the joins and used dots of superglue around the edges just to hold everything in place while the epoxy cured overnight. This is also where I decided to have his left arm a little forward, right arm a little back, and head turned slightly to the left. A kind of standard I'm carrying a big gun walking pose. Now he was assembled, I gave him a coat of satin varnish to smooth everything off, and then realised I hadn't painted the arms, so they were still bright red under the shoulder pads. I mixed up some black and burnt umber oil paints, thinned them down with white spirit, and went around filling in any of the areas that would really be in deep shadow, like under the shoulder plate. When that second coat of oils dried, I went back over him with a critical eye and decided, stuff it, good enough. So here he is in all of his mostly finished glory.
Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio. Sorry, there's probably no Horatios watching, are there? Anyway, the underpainting of this little guy is finished. So there we go. And yes, I did just say underpainting. This is like the base layer. There's a whole nother bit to come. But that will be next time. Anyway, let me know if you enjoyed it. And maybe I'll see you again.